Margaret Whitmore had been married to Richard for 40 years. She thought she knew him. She thought they had built a life together, quiet, steady, comfortable. Their kind of marriage didn't need big words or fancy gestures. It was built on habits, routines, morning coffee in silence, holidays with friends, a kiss on the forehead before bed. She stood by him through everything, his long hours at the office, the nights he came home distracted, the times he forgot anniversaries. She told herself that's just how life goes when you marry a busy man. And when he died, she mourned like any wife would. Dressed in black, greeted the guests, shook every hand. People kept saying how strong she looked. How proud he must have been to have a woman like her by his side. But no one saw her later that night, sitting alone on their bed, holding his watch like it still meant something. No one saw the way the silence in the house changed. How it felt heavier every day. How sometimes she'd walk past his closet just to catch a bit of his cologne. 3 weeks after the funeral, she was just starting to breathe again. She was trying to figure out what the rest of her life might look like. Then a letter showed up. No return address. Just her name on the front. Inside were names she didn't know. And instructions. About money. About property. About a family she never knew existed. That was the moment it hit her. Her husband hadn't just left her behind. He left behind a secret. One she never saw coming. If you like story like this, stories about truth, love, and the things we don't see coming, go ahead and like this video and subscribe to the channel. We have more real, emotional stories waiting for you. Margaret Whitmore was the kind of woman who never made a fuss. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't ask for more than she was given. She believed in staying calm, doing what's right, and keeping her private life just that private. She'd been married to Richard for 40 years. She gave him her best years, supported his work, kept their home in order, and stood beside him through every business deal, every dinner, every boardroom victory. People knew his name. They called him a success. She was the quiet one at his side, smiling politely while the men shook hands. Margaret had her routines. She woke early, made coffee just how Richard liked it, took walks in the garden. She wasn't flashy. She didn't need to be. The life they had built together felt solid, not perfect, but steady. And after all these years, that counted for something. But the truth is she didn't really know what Richard did when he traveled. He was always flying somewhere. Always busy. She never asked too many questions. That's just how things were between them. He took care of the outside world, and she took care of everything else. They never had children. They tried in the beginning. There was a loss, quiet, painful. And then it just never happened. Margaret buried that grief somewhere deep and learned to smile through it. She didn't talk about it. Not with friends. Not with Richard. Especially not with herself. And now, after everything, there was this letter. Names she didn't know. People she had never heard of. A woman named Elena Castillo. 2 kids. Money set aside. Property listed. Arrangements made. It didn't take long to figure it out. This wasn't a business matter. It was personal. Very personal. Margaret didn't tell anyone. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She packed a small bag, took the printed documents, and booked a flight to New Mexico. She needed to see for herself who this woman was, and why her husband had taken care of her, even in death. When she arrived in Santa Fe, the air was warm and dry. The sun was brighter than what she was used to back home. The neighborhood was quiet. Simple houses. Clean yards. A few children riding bikes. She followed the address listed on the trust papers and stopped in front of a cream-colored home with blue window frames. A small cactus by the steps. Nothing fancy. Just real. She stood there for a moment, holding her purse tight, then knocked. The door opened. Elena looked straight at her. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't rude. She just looked at Margaret like she already knew who she was. They stood there, 2 women who had shared the same man. One through a marriage certificate, the other through something harder to name. "I'm Margaret Whitmore," she said, her voice steady. "I think we need to talk." Elena nodded. "Yes. I know." Margaret didn't expect what came next. It wasn't a fight. It wasn't a scene. It was quiet. Elena stepped aside, but Margaret didn't move just yet. Because right behind her, in the hallway, Margaret saw a picture hanging on the wall. Richard. Smiling. One arm around a teenage boy, the other around a girl. They looked like a family. And for the first time, Margaret didn't feel like a wife. She felt like a stranger. If you've ever looked at someone you loved and wondered what parts of them you never really knew, you're not alone. If this chapter moved you, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. There's more to Margaret's story and many others like it, still to come. Margaret didn't sleep much that night. The hotel room felt too quiet, too unfamiliar. She kept replaying the visit in her mind. The way Elena looked at her, calm but guarded. The photo in the hallway. Richard's face. His smile. It was different from the one she knew. Softer. Like he had let his guard down. Margaret hadn't seen that version of him in years. The next morning, she called Elena and asked to meet again. This time, Elena agreed to talk at a small cafe downtown. They sat outside, the air dry and still. Elena ordered tea. Margaret didn't order anything. She just wanted answers. She asked the questions gently at first. How long had they been together? Did Elena know he was married? What had he told her? Elena answered carefully. She said they had met in New York during one of his trips. She said she didn't know about Margaret for the first few years. And when she finally found out, he told her it was complicated. That Margaret was cold. That the marriage was for appearances. That he had stayed for business reasons. Margaret listened without reacting. But inside it stung. Cold. Appearances? She had spent her life keeping their home steady, his life in order. She had loved him the only way she knew how. And now, here was another woman who believed she had been the real thing. Elena said Richard visited often. Called every week. Sent money. Wrote letters. He had been part of her children's lives. He went to Gabriel's baseball games. Helped Sophia with her schoolwork. He wasn't just a check in the mail. He was their dad. Margaret felt something hard settle in her chest. She had never seen him play catch. Never heard him read aloud. She had begged him once to take a weekend off so they could visit the coast. He said he couldn't. Work came first. She looked at Elena's hands resting on the table. No ring. Just a simple silver bracelet. She wondered if Richard had given it to her. If he'd ever taken her dancing. Said things to her in the dark that Margaret never heard. Then Elena said something that stopped everything. I didn't ask for this, Margaret. I didn't ask to be hidden. I didn't ask for the money. I just wanted my children to know their father. Margaret said nothing. She believed her. That was the hardest part. But the silence between them was starting to feel too heavy. So Margaret stood up, thanked her for her time, and walked away. She didn't go back to the hotel. She walked. For hours. Through the streets, past shops, past strangers laughing at cafe tables. She thought about all the years she had sat alone at home while Richard was here, living this other life. She wondered how many birthdays he had missed with her, so he could be present here. With them. Back at the hotel, she opened the trust papers again. Read every line. Studied the names, the numbers, the signatures. The estate was being divided. Not just cash. There was property too. A vacation home in Napa Valley. Margaret's favorite place. The only place Richard ever took her where he seemed truly relaxed. She had thought that home was theirs. A place for the two of them. Now she saw it listed as part of the children's inheritance. That night, she called her lawyer back in Connecticut. Asked if the will could be contested. The lawyer was careful with his words. He said the documents were solid. The trust was legally binding. It would be difficult to undo without causing a public case. And even then, it wouldn't be a sure thing. Margaret didn't respond right away. She hung up, sat in silence, and stared at the hotel ceiling for a long time. The next morning, she returned to Elena's house. This time, Elena was outside watering plants. The kids weren't home. Margaret asked if they could talk again. Elena nodded and set down the hose. They sat on the porch. Margaret spoke first. I don't hate you, she said quietly. But I don't know how to feel right now. Elena didn't speak. Margaret continued. I gave him my life. And somehow, I still feel like I'm the one left with nothing. Elena looked down, then up. You're not the only one who feels that way. They sat for a long time without saying anything more. That night, back in the hotel, Margaret started packing. She was going home. But she wasn't going back to her old life. Because the life she thought she had was never real to begin with. If this story is speaking to you, If you've ever had to face a truth you weren't ready for, we invite you to like this video and subscribe to the channel. More powerful, emotional stories like this one are on the way. Margaret flew back to Connecticut 2 days later. She didn't cry on the plane. She didn't sleep either. She just stared out the window, her hands folded in her lap, the same way she always did when something was too heavy to carry out loud. When she got home, the house felt colder than before. She walked through each room slowly, touching the walls, the furniture, the old family photos that had meant something once. The vase on the table. The reading glasses Richard left by the couch. Everything was in its place. But nothing felt the same. The letter was still on the kitchen counter, where she had first read it. She picked it up and stared at the names again. Elena Castillo, Gabriel Whitmore, Sophia Whitmore. He had given them his last name. She hadn't noticed that before. That detail hit her hard. Later that week, Margaret decided to go through the safe. It was built into the floor of Richard's study, hidden under a rug, something only the two of them had access to. She hadn't opened it since the funeral. Inside, she found their usual documents, property titles, stock records, passports. But underneath those, there was something else. A small black box. And inside the box, an old leather-bound notebook. Richard's handwriting. Clean. Careful. She sat in the study chair and started reading. It wasn't a journal. It was a letter. One long letter. To her. It was dated nearly 2 years before he died. He started by saying he wasn't sure if she'd ever read it. That he didn't know how to explain the things he had done. That maybe this was the only way she'd understand him. Then came the part that made her stomach turn. He wrote about how he had met Elena. How it wasn't supposed to last. How he thought it was just a moment of weakness. But then time passed. Feelings grew. And so did guilt. He said he tried to leave, more than once, but he couldn't bring himself to walk away from the children. He knew what he had done was wrong. That it wasn't fair. To her. To Elena. To the children. But by the time he realized how far it had gone, he felt like it was too late. And so he chose to live 2 lives. One on paper. One in secret. Then came the part that broke Margaret's heart wide open. Richard admitted that the vacation home in Napa wasn't for business getaways like he had always said. It was where he took Elena and the kids. Birthdays. Summers. He even wrote that their daughter, Sophia, called it her happy place. Margaret put the notebook down for a moment. She stared at the window, eyes burning, chest tight. She remembered how hard she had worked to make that house special. The wine tastings. The garden. The meals she learned to cook from scratch. She had thought those were their moments. She had no idea she was walking through someone else's memories. She turned back to the pages. There was more. Richard wrote about the miscarriage. About how cold he had been afterward. He admitted he didn't know how to comfort her. That he had buried himself in work instead. That he had shut her out, not because he didn't care, but because he didn't know how to deal with the pain. And when he met Elena years later, it felt easier to be someone new. He said he was ashamed of that. And scared. That's why he never told the truth. By the time Margaret reached the end of the letter, her hands were shaking. The last line read, "I know I can't ask for forgiveness, but if there's one thing I hope, it's that one day you'll understand that I never stopped loving you. Even in my silence." She sat there for a long time. The house is quiet. The light from the window slowly fading. It wasn't just cheating. It wasn't even the children. It was a lie. The double life. The fact that for 40 years she had been playing a part in a story that was only half real. She thought about Elena. About the porch. About the way she looked tired but honest. And about those children. His children. She didn't know what to think of them. But she couldn't hate them. That night, Margaret pulled out a photo album from the cabinet. She flipped through pages of family events, vacations, business galas. Richard was there in every one, standing tall, smiling for the camera. But now, all she could see were the blank spaces between the photos, the weekends he said he had meetings, the sudden trips that didn't make sense, the long phone calls he always took in another room. The truth had changed everything. Her marriage. Her memories. Even the way she looked at herself. And for the first time in her life, Margaret didn't know what to do next. The days after Margaret read the letter felt like walking through someone else's home. Every room held a memory she couldn't trust anymore. The study, where she'd brought Richard tea during his late nights. The kitchen, where they always ate in silence but never in anger. The backyard, where she once imagined their grandchildren would play. That dream felt far away now, like something from another life. She stopped answering phone calls, stopped replying to texts. Her friends meant well, but they didn't know what to say. What could they say? She hadn't told them the truth. Not yet. She wasn't ready. Margaret began sorting through more of Richard's things. Old drawers. Boxes in the attic. She found receipts from plane tickets she never knew he took. Gifts she never received. Photos of the children from birthdays, graduations, all tucked in an envelope labeled for safekeeping. It was all there. Proof that her husband had been living two lives. Carefully, quietly, and deliberately. She didn't eat much. Couldn't sleep right either. The nights felt too long. The house too still. She started walking in the mornings just to be around people, even if they were strangers. One morning, she stopped by a local bakery. The woman behind the counter knew her by name. Margaret had been coming there for years. But this time, when she smiled, Margaret didn't smile back. She just said thank you, paid in cash, and left. News of the trust had started to spread. Nothing in the papers, but word had a way of traveling in quiet towns. A woman from Margaret's church asked if the rumors were true. About Richard. About the children. Margaret just nodded. The woman placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, then walked away without saying another word. People didn't look at her the same anymore. Some looked sorry. Others curious. A few looked smug. Like they had always suspected something, but never said it. At night, Margaret sat at the kitchen table with her lawyer on speakerphone. They discussed options. Challenging the trust would mean court dates. Headlines. Public questions. Family names in places they didn't belong. She had every right to fight. But the thought of dragging the children through it made her hesitate. They hadn't asked for any of this. One afternoon, a package arrived from Santa Fe. No note. Just a drawing. Crayons on thick paper. A treehouse. A boy and a girl. 3 stick figures. The third figure had glasses. Margaret looked closer. Her. She didn't know how to feel. She had never met the children. Never spoken to them. And yet somehow they knew about her. She set the drawing on the counter and sat down slowly. She stared at it for a long time. The Richard she remembered wouldn't have told the kids about her. But the man who wrote that notebook, the man who apologized and admitted he had been wrong, maybe he did. Maybe he wanted them to know. Later that week, she got a letter in the mail. Handwritten. From Elena. She wrote that she didn't want trouble. That she wasn't asking for anything. That she hoped Margaret was okay. That the kids were asking questions she didn't know how to answer. And that if Margaret ever wanted to talk, she would listen. No pressure. Just an open door. Margaret didn't respond right away. But she kept the letter. A few days later, she received a message from her accountant. One of the Napa properties had been cleared for ownership transfer. It was the same one listed in the children's trust. The house she once believed was hers alone. The house that had held her happiest memories. She stared at the folder for hours before opening it. Inside were forms waiting for her signature. If she signed, it would belong to the kids. If she didn't, the estate would hold it until the case was resolved. Margaret sat with a pen in her hand. She thought about the garden in the back. The wine cellar. The bench where Richard once told her he was proud of her. One of the only times he ever said it out loud. She closed the folder and pushed it aside. That night, she pulled out the drawing again. The treehouse. The 3 stick figures. She looked at the third figure. The one with the glasses. She had always worn glasses. But maybe it was more than that. Maybe they had been told who she was. Maybe they saw her as part of the story. Not the enemy. Not the obstacle. Just someone who mattered. Margaret didn't know what she was going to do. But she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't pretend anymore. The truth was out. And whether she liked it or not, it was changing her life. Margaret stared at the signature line on the papers again. The house in Napa. The one she once believed was just for her and Richard. She had walked those floors in bare feet. Cooked dinner in that kitchen. Watched the sun go down from the deck with a glass of red wine and the sound of his voice somewhere nearby. At least she thought it was his voice. Now she didn't know. The memories didn't feel like hers anymore. They felt borrowed. Shared. The air in that house had held stories she hadn't known were unfolding. Stories told in laughter she never heard. Birthdays she never attended. Faces she'd never seen. And now the children, his children, had been written into the home she once loved. On paper. Legally. Permanently. She had the power to contest it. She still had lawyers, resources, friends who would stand by her. But she kept thinking about that drawing. 3 stick figures. A treehouse. Her included, even if they'd never met her. She couldn't ignore that. And she couldn't forget the notebook. Richard had failed her. No question. But in the quiet, in the end, he had also told the truth. And that mattered. It didn't fix what was broken. But it meant he tried. Even if too late. She didn't rush. She took a week. Spent time alone. Went back to the garden in their backyard and pulled weeds that had grown wild. Walked through the house with no music playing. Let herself feel everything she had pushed down for weeks. Anger. Sadness. Regret. Even moments of guilt she couldn't explain. She realized she wasn't just grieving Richard. She was grieving the version of herself she had been for 40 years. The quiet partner. The woman who didn't ask questions. The one who held her tongue and kept the peace. That version of her was gone now. And what came next would have to be something new. Something she hadn't figured out yet. One morning, before the sun was fully up, Margaret stood at the kitchen counter, opened the folder, and signed the transfer papers. No dramatic music. No shaking hands. Just a quiet breath and a pen moving across the page. Then she closed the folder, picked up the drawing from the fridge, and folded it gently into her purse. 3 days later, she boarded a flight back to New Mexico. This time, she didn't book a hotel. She sent a message instead. Short. Direct. I'd like to visit the house. If that's okay. Elena replied within the hour. Yes. You're welcome anytime. When Margaret arrived, it was just after lunch. The front door opened before she knocked. The children stood nearby. Older than she expected. Gabriel wore a baseball cap. Sophia had a book tucked under her arm. They didn't rush to hug her. But they didn't hide either. Elena invited her in, motioned toward the living room. Margaret sat slowly. Looked around. Family pictures on the wall. A blanket folded neatly on the couch. The home felt lived in. Full of warmth. Nothing fancy. Just real. Elena brought her tea. No questions. No speeches. Just quiet. Margaret turned to the children. She reached into her purse and took out a photograph. It was one of Richard. From years ago. A photo she had always kept in her bedroom drawer. He looked younger. Calm. A rare smile on his face. She handed it to them. Told them that was the man she married. The one she had known. The children leaned in, looked carefully. Then Gabriel asked her what kind of music Richard liked. She told them jazz. And how he always left his records out, never put them back in the sleeves. Sophia asked if he cooked. Margaret smiled for the first time in days. Said no, but he liked to act like he could. It wasn't a full conversation. Just enough to shift something in the room. Later that evening, Margaret stood outside by the porch. The sun was going down. The light was soft. Elena joined her. For a long time, they didn't speak. Then Elena said, "You didn't have to come here." Margaret nodded. "I know. But I wanted to. I needed to see what he built, and what I missed." Elena looked down, then back at her. "He talked about you. The last few years. A lot more than before." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "What did he say?" Elena's answer was simple. That you were the only person who ever really saw him. He just didn't know how to live with it. Margaret didn't answer. But something in her face softened. She understood now. It wasn't about winning or losing. It wasn't about who was first or who came later. It was about what she chose to carry forward, the silence or the truth. And standing there, on a porch in a town she never meant to visit, she made her choice. Not for Richard. Not for the children. For herself. A few months passed. Seasons changed. The trees in Margaret's yard began to bloom again. The same garden she once tended for Richard now looked different under her care. She didn't hire a landscaper. She did the work herself. It gave her something to hold on to. Something to finish. She no longer avoided the Napa home on paper. She transferred full ownership to the children, no questions, no conditions. It wasn't easy. But it felt right. She kept the original deeds in a folder, tucked away, along with the drawing from Sophia and Gabriel, and the notebook Richard had written. She didn't throw anything out. But she didn't go back to that house either. Some places are better left as memories. Even if they belong to someone else now. Margaret started volunteering twice a week at the community library. The same one she and Richard used to donate to every year. She didn't tell anyone why. She just showed up, shelved books, and helped children pick out stories. She liked the quiet. She liked seeing people discover something new. She didn't talk much about her past. Not at first. People just knew her as Margaret. Kind, gentle, reliable. That was enough. On Sundays, she stopped attending her old church. She began going to a smaller one a few towns over. Fewer questions. No long stares. She didn't need sympathy. She needed space. She sat near the back, listened to the choir, lit a candle afterward, and left quietly. Always the same routine. One afternoon, a letter arrived in her mailbox. Handwritten. It was from Sophia. She thanked Margaret for coming. Said her dad had told them she was strong. That she used to be a teacher. That she made the best apple pie he'd ever had. Sophia ended the letter by saying she hoped one day, if it was okay, they could visit the garden in Connecticut. She had never seen snow before. Margaret read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in the same drawer with the others. She didn't write back right away. But she knew she would. Margaret didn't rebuild her life with big steps. She moved slowly, thoughtfully, the way she always had. But this time, something had changed. For the first time in her life, she was making choices just for herself. She wasn't living in someone else's shadow. She wasn't filling in the gaps of another person's story. She was starting her own. Even if it was quiet. Even if it was small. She never stopped missing Richard. She never would. But the pain softened. It didn't go away. It just became part of her. Like an old scar that no longer hurts but never fully fades. She forgave him in her own time. Not because he deserved it, but because she needed the weight to lift. Sometimes she still heard his voice in her head. The way he used to call her name from across the house. The sound of him laughing at something on the radio. But when those memories came, she didn't push them away anymore. She let them in. Let them pass. Then she moved on with her day. And in the quiet hours, when the house was still and the light from the window stretched long across the floor, Margaret would sometimes sit in her chair, close her eyes, and think about everything that had happened. All the things she didn't expect. All the truths she never asked to carry. And somehow she had made it through. Not untouched. But not broken. Just different. If this story touched you, if you've ever had to face something you didn't ask for, and still found a way to stand tall, we hope you'll take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel and share the video. There are more stories coming. Stories about truth, about healing, and about finding peace when the world doesn't make it easy. Thank you for watching.